Um, Thank you, Srdja, for bringing us all here across, literally across the globe, different time zones. It's always a pleasure to be in company of you, Srdja, and all the dear colleagues. I also thank Edmonton University for hosting this event, and all the colleagues behind the screens, all people who have joined us. It is 3:15 a.m. in Melbourne, where I'm sitting. It's Sunday already here, so I'm talking from the future, which does not make me more energetic or alert. I'm actually feeling a bit getting tired. I wanted to talk about being led by the team of today's conference. I wanted to talk about how suffering and also denialism and triumphalism are voiced, how they are articulated on the ground. And I will talk about Bosnia, more specifically to focus on Srebrenica. And sadly, it is topical. Sadly, in terms of that the war, did not end, or talks about the war are still filling the pages and dominating news from Bosnia these days. Let's hope that this will be just a passing news, but situation on the ground over the last 26 years since the war ended has not been so brilliant either. The war in Bosnia and Herzegovina and in much of Yugoslavia, excluding Kosovo, did end in 1995. With the Dayton Peace Agreement, and one of the most important parts of Dayton Peace Agreements, which was to stop the war, was to bring people back, is known as the agreement, as Annex 7, Agreement of Refugees and Displaced Persons. It's a very brief document, very precise, and it was really there to undo the ethnic cleansing, to bring people back, and to reconstruct the country, to start kind of peace building, not in excluded venues, but on the ground where people used to live and they were expected to return. Sadly, this did not happen, and country remained ethnically divided, ethnic division solidified in many ways. And today, in some places, we have even kind of ethnically homogeneous populations that are more homogeneous than they were during the conflict. If we go outside of big cities, such as Banja Luka or Sarajevo or Tuzla, if you go on the periphery in northern Bosnia or in eastern Bosnia, we will come across places like this, or places that don't exist anymore, with ruins of homes, with hardly any people present there. So when talking about, yes, sorry, my presentation here. Some of these pictures, and they are recent pictures taken a few years ago when I was in Bosnia. As an ethnographer, I do travel and spend time in these devastated communities. So some of these pictures are very surreal, because they do demonstrate both its natural beauty and also house and someone's home that used to be, and how much love and energy and creativity was invested in these structures that do not exist, and people actually do not exist either. So there are still marks of war. Until recently, in many of the sites that I used to work, there were also landmine signs. Now there are less of them. There are also less of people who returned. Many of them died, and as it was mentioned a few times in previous presentations, these victims and people who are returnees, who survivors, they don't call themselves victims. There's also a plethora of other identities, depending on loss, depending on gender, material status, and so on. Rather than facilitating return through reparations, as Jessie Hronesova has written and argued in her book. Returnees were turned in charity cases categories. Instead of reparations, there were donations, and donations were literally going through charity organizations, and included from religious organizations to Western European NGOs or government-funded projects, which, as I said, turned those survivors into or kept them in some charity categories rather than kind of a dignified return that they expected. Nonetheless, the survivors very often recreated their life among the ruins, literally, and in some instances repurposed those ruins, but they are kind of monuments to who they used to be, or monuments to their lost communities. If those researchers that Eric mentioned, those pre-1990s researchers came down to the region without really looking what happened there in the last 30 years, they would come across completely new vocabulary, completely new categories. So povratnici or returnees is not just it is both legal category, but it's also a social category, and it has different connotations. It's not, as I said, always attributed to something that involves a dignified return, but it can be also regarded as a charity or burden for the society or some part of the communities. And this is not across ethnic divide or across, depending on ethnicity, but literally within the ethnic cohorts, there would be these differences. Raseljeno lice, or IDPs, as we like to call it, is also a very new category of people. And again, it's not just a legal category, it's also social category, very often linked to gender, as most of the Raseljeno lica, the displaced, internally displaced, have been and continue to be women survivors. Another big category, nestali, disappeared or the missing. In particular cases, there are also families that, for example, with the Bosniak or Muslim communities, the šehijska porodica is again a term that's sometimes might be perceived as involving some dignified status, but in other very often it's perceived as a burden. And many other fine kind of linguistic innovations that have become part of post-Dayton Bosnia, such as those who didn't survive or didn't survive the march, for example, from Srebrenica, those who nisu prešli kroz šumu, postponed mourning because of the missing people. There's odgođeno žalovanje, where it kind of prolonged or never-ending closure in terms of burying the remains of the missing people, mass graves, and not just mass graves, but primary, secondary mass grave sites, exhumations, exhumacije. This is all language that ordinary people use, are familiar with. And like with many other concepts, other words kind of that came in that period, they don't even try to translate them or to kind of vernacularize them to find appropriate meaning or translation to their own language or regional kind. And in that post Dayton reality, archives that were destroyed during the war are now, we have new kind of archives. They are morgues where human remains are kept, and then the identities re-established in the process, both their physical identities, but also their legal identities. DNA matching and blood relations, and blood as essence of identity has also gained scientific validation, and with the survivors' blood being used to identify the missing relatives, and sometimes even wives can assist in identifying their perished husbands through shared DNA with children. Mass burials, reassociation, And even ontological questions, what constitutes a person? Person being or skeletal, or human skeleton containing 206 bones, and in many cases, in the victims exhumed from mass graves and buried in some of these cemeteries, such as in Prijedor or Srebrenica, only would have a handful of bones. Geography has changed not only through ethnic division of the country, through also mass graves, all these spots across Bosnia. Exhumations do look very, as there's nothing that could be kind of detached or scientific. It's very, very crude way of how these processes are approached and done. And identification of the victims is an ongoing process. In the process, so the articulating or giving identity to the missing person is again a new language. Public events in some parts of the country look like this. They are collective burials of victims in Srebrenica. And it has gone as far as to the survivors who were settled in countries as far as Canada and United States and Australia, so that they plan their holidays, so they save their days from their work, that they can travel in the period when these mass burials take place. Very often they bury their own relatives, but it's a kind of new tradition, which is has increasingly become also beyond the local community, but it's really for the local community where they get together and get reunited with those who survived and also those who perished. And that reunion is again very embodied, even though sometimes these coffins are more symbols of bodies than they really contain a full body. And it is geography across Bosnia. The landscape has changed. The purpose of landscape. There are new monument, new rituals, and something that has not been witnessed in the history of the country. Such massive burials, which also had affected how religious ceremonies are performed. And I'm here particularly talking about Muslim victims, even though in this particular, for example, burial also, there was a Catholic victim that was buried together with Muslim victims, but it is where the religious rituals had to be adjusted and kind of invented in a way that didn't have tradition before. Even the burials do not make that closure, bringing about closure to traditional justice. So identification process is not finished very often once a funeral has taken place, because spread of bones, of human remains across several sites very often leads to exhumation of the grave and adding of the bones, which in many instances keeps happening periodically for many years to come. So for the survivors, there's not kind of closure, because there's even word that this didn't exist, dokopavanje, which technically is reassociation. Of course, it makes sense to forensic anthropologists, but to local people, this is dokopavanje. So like a ongoing burial almost. Families have also some families have created their own forms of memorializations in their private domain at homes, bringing those who they lost and those who in some instances were born after the war together in one place symbolically. Those who migrated as part of refugee resettlement programs to far away destinations such as Melbourne or St. Louis have also voiced their solidarity or their loss with fellow survivors and compatriots back in Bosnia with public events and really with messages that calling for peace, should never happen. Srebrenica should never happen to anyone. The prayer was the same. Sometimes, especially members of generation that are now in 20s and 30s, who were children when they lost their relatives, are using their own bodies, which kind of is appropriating popular culture of tattooing, but adding very, very personal messages and very, again, new tradition, because even these are obviously Muslim symbols, but in Islam, tattooing is not in. It's kind of against religion. But this, again, a new tradition, a new way of voicing memory and identity. At the same time, we have a very, very flourishing culture of triumphalism. And here I do not talk about not perpetrators, but sympathizers, so those who identify themselves with crimes. And it goes beyond the 10th stage of genocide. It goes beyond denialism, denial of crimes, because it's triumphalism, where these crimes are literally celebrated as we'll show in a few slides, through popular culture, through mainstream media, through political speeches, and through everyday life of ordinary people, which is kind of the most worrying and most disappointing. In Srebrenica, every 11th July, there would be some access, there would be posters with this, and this is now more mainstream than extremism, because there are organizations that are registered and funded and they actually stand behind this campaign. So putting billboards and posters celebrating war criminals that were found guilty of their crimes, erecting huge exclusive symbols in places that were multi-ethnic or went through horrific sufferings, even religious objects on private land, and it took 30 years for Fata Olovic to get her front yard cleaned from that structure. Inscribing triumphalism literally in public places, and it's something that's completely in. Choosing the places where these acts of triumphalism are performed is also very instrumental, very strategic. For example, this Draža Mihajlović billboard in Foča is literally across the sports hall Partizan, which was used as a rape camp, 1992. Hall was reconstructed, renovated with the EU money, but across there's that huge billboard in the heart of the city. On graffitis are not, they are not anarchist graffitis any longer that dominate, walls in the region, but they are, calling for genocide to be repeated. It goes as far as soccer fans and hooligan groups or mainstream supporters using triumphalist messages, such as No Žica Srebrenica, kind of as something that has become a norm. It's not regarded as extremism, or at least they are not. It hasn't been sanctioned. Popular media, very much it's using the airtime to very often mock, if not directly deny or perform triumphalism, but hosting convicted war criminals as their guests, such as Šešelj, a regular guest at the TV program Čirilica with Milorad Marić. Social media used also to send some strange messages, involving young children. At weddings and parties, birthday parties, there are songs that are calling for repetition of Vukovar, repetition of Srebrenica and other places, and it is at the moments when people start their new happy lives, when they should be celebrating lives. This has kind of become so mainstream that it's not even felt as something that would be regarded as hate speech or just something inappropriate. And sadly, the triumphalism and acts of kind of articulating what happened there during the 1990s doesn't stay in the Balkans. So what happened in the Balkans doesn't stay in the Balkans, as I say. So some of these crimes through popular culture, through access to social media and internet platforms have inspired acts of terrorism in Australia and in Norway, and we have written about that, can be read. But has also been, those who are genocide deniers have been, awarded prestigious prizes such as Nobel Prize recently. And so what I thought, rather than presenting this bleak picture of the region, and the current reports coming from there are not also very optimistic. What could be done to use all these sentences issued by The Hague in a way that they create some change, would be really in the communities, not only the communities from where not only where the crimes were perpetrated, but also in the communities from where the perpetrators come, to use the original quotes from sentences and put them as billboards. I know Natasha Kandic is trying to remove, Mladic mural in Belgrade, but this, what's going to be instead? So, for example, in Vlasenica, a town from where Dragan Nikolic, a convicted war criminal, comes and it's serving his sentence. So just extracting one paragraph and putting it in all the languages in these places could hopefully lead to some reflections. At this moment, or in the last 25 years, 30 years, there hasn't been kind of alternative to this. I remember in early 2000, when I was in Kosovo, there was, there were all these billboards, hug a Serb, drink coffee with an Albanian, kind of a bit of patronizing, but at least there was something. And in Bosnia, there hasn't been any public campaign of kind of to counter triumphalism, to counter the formation and mainstreaming of extremism in a way that has been happening. So that's a kind of something pragmatic and optimistic, which I hope can be implemented and should be implemented. But without going on any longer, I'll finish this presentation now here, and I would be very happy to elaborate on anything or to answer questions that you might have, which I might not even addressed in my presentation. So it's 20 to 4 a.m. In Melbourne, and have a bit of understanding if some of my talk was a bit, all over the place. Thank you. Srdja, should we go on? And Sinisha is raising his hands, or is Srdja frozen?
We lost him.
He's moving.
I am now absolutely beyond positive. I'm beyond positive that the big brother is watching, because every time I wanted to say something, I would lose the internet connection. I do apologize profusely for this and for something I have no control over. I do appreciate your benevolence and patience. I just wanted to say that we will have a discussion following the presentation by Professor Velikonja, so every 2 or 3 presentations. So those of you who would like to ask questions of Professor Halilovich, please write them down or send them as a Q&A function here, and we'll address those questions following the presentation by Professor Velikonja. I do hope that the internet connection will remain stable. Now, Professor Mitja Velikonja from the Department of Cultural Studies, University of Ljubljana, will talk to us about poetry after Srebrenica, a cultural reflection on the Yugoslav crisis or the Yugoslav society in the 1980s. Professor Velikonja, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I would like to share my screen, but just a second. Do you see?
Not yet.
Not yet. Oops.
Not yet.
Just a second. Can you help me? Where do I?
Okay, let me take a look. There should be a share screen.
Yes, I share screen. What do I?
Then desktop.
Desktop.
Oh.
Share screen. Desktop.
Maybe Rochelle could intervene here and save us all.
Do you see the green icon at the bottom bar of your Zoom window that says share screen? There you go.
Okay.
There you
Super.
go.
Do you see?
Yes, there you go.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much.
Oh, you reappear now. You reappear on a second screen.
Yeah,
okay,
yeah. Okay, yeah. Now we're going. Okay. First, thanks to Srdja for inviting me to this wonderful company. I'm going to present a topic that is in my mind for a long time, and this is post-Yugoslav artistic and cultural images of the 80s. Partly because it fits to my academic interest in general, and this is cultural dynamics and above all cultural resistance of the post-Yugoslav and post-socialist transition, so 2 posts, decisively shaped by 2 leading ideologies and political practices, ethno-nationalism and neoliberalism on the other side. And partly also because I was also an 80s kid, intellectually and culturally grown in this decade. So this decade was very formative, very intense for me on different levels. And I would like to start with a small anecdote. I defended my BA thesis on the day when the first Slovenian so-called democratic government was formed in May of 1990. So I know many sides of this story, from the lived one, personal, the one in how it is reflected in art and culture, and also in social sciences, and both sides of the story. So 80s and what happened later on. The starting point of my presentation will be this graffiti that practically did not change in the last 30 and something years. It is placed in the wider center of Ljubljana, and as you see, the first photo was taken in 1990 when it already existed for a year or 2, I believe, and the last one just a few weeks ago. So the main questions that I posed some years ago when I started first extensively and then intensively to work on this topic is how to understand the Yugoslav 80s today. How do we write, paint, make records about it, to write poetry, music, and so on, how to think about the 80s now after the bloody collapse of Yugoslavia. So how to write poetry, to say in a more dramatic word, using this Adorno's question after the Second World War, after what happened in Srebrenica, Vukovar, and hundreds of other killing fields from 1990s on. So I'm not a historian, I'm a cultural studies scholar, and I will not go back in time. I'm interested in how this decade is present today in cultural and artistic map. So in the artscape of the post-Yugoslav, of post-Yugoslavia. So I analyzed the various types of artistic and cultural constructions and construction and reflection of the last Yugoslav decade after its collapse in 1991. So how the Yugoslavia was represented in its artistic and cultural representations in that particular decade. There are many problems in my research. I would just post in the beginning the first two, and these are also the limitation. I would like to speak about these limitations in advance, just to understand better my points that I will develop later. First, it's extremely difficult to isolate this decade from the previous one. So it's a kind of continuity from the previous decades, from the previous years. But on the other side, there's kind of schizophrenic situation. It's very easy to separate them from the next decade. So on one side, we have this continuity. On the other side, very sharp discontinuity. And secondly, this is extremely big topic, wide topic. Last 3 decades, different post-Yugoslav countries, discussions that are taking place outside Yugoslavia, in diaspora, and so on. So it's really it's a huge work, and I would like just to point out the main points that I came to, and I included them in the text that will be published shortly by Serbian Helsinki committee in the project that is led by Sonja Biserko. So I was working on the very different fields: literature, film, music, popular and consumer culture, different exhibitions, retrospectives, online representations, and so on, with a clear goal. As I said, I'm not a historian, but you know, I rely on the opinions or the artists reflecting this decade, and on the opinion of Masha Kolanovic, a Croatian comparativist, who wrote that fiction in general has no ambition to provide complete or privileged truth, but rather works in a space in which there is a plurality of truth. So the aim of my research was artistic and cultural reflections and reinventions of the Yugoslav 80s. The main directions are 3 to reduce this complexity. The first one is affirmative or sweet. The second one is negative, and in between they're kind of balanced or bittersweet attitude. But let's put this discussion in the wider frame. In the wider frame of ideological hegemony and practical policy of neoliberalism and ethno-nationalism, both are militantly anti-Yugoslav and anti-socialist. And these two ideological constructions and also practical policies triumphed, won in the last 3 and something decades, not only in Yugoslavia, but I think also in terms of the whole Europe or globally. And they are the leading ideologies and also practices also in former Yugoslavia. So when it comes to Yugoslavia, and especially about the 80s, we find a combination of rejection, demonization, ignorance, amnesia, or even exorcism towards Yugoslavia. And I would like to start with one of the most prolific literary genres in the region, of those who can be considered as a kind of memory entrepreneurs. So the leading politicians or the people in power, the previous power or the future power, some of them even both sides, who wrote about the dissolution of Yugoslavia. There are some names that I'm mentioning, you know, the kind of avalanche of of memoirs developed from the 90s on, but also on the other side of the so-called winners of the transition, those who gained in the new states, from Stipe Mesic with his early works already from the beginning of 90s to Martin Špegel, Jan Šarupel, Izetbegovic, and the others. So on one side, we have a very, very well-defined Yugophobia that, of course, differs in different decades and also by the different protagonists, but it's still there. So this negative attitude toward Yugoslavia. On the other side, and this is very interesting, we will find uncritical images of the sweet Yugoslav 80s, mostly in the popular culture. So a dominant Yugophilia, if I may say so. And I went through, as I said, different fields, starting with, of course, with music. Ana Petrov, a wonderful Belgrade-based sociologist of nostalgia. She speaks about pop musicians, post-Yugoslav, turning to post-Yugoslav pop musicians as the great pacifiers of the region. She wrote a fantastic book about the concerts that she attended, and she did research about the Yugoslav bands and different singer-songwriters, performing in different parts of Yugoslavia. Old, if I may say so, eternal Yugoslav bands from Novi Posili to Pankrti are having their farewell tours every year or two. Then there are many new Yugo-nostalgic bands from Slovenia to Bosnia and Herzegovina, and separate, individual song about this Dionysian 80s. So good old times, the belle epoque of the 80s, when cela Yugoslavia pleasure igra rock and roll in this sense. Then a special genre of music studies developed, collections, biographies about the 80s, about punk musicians and punk phenomena as such, new wave, Belgrade Spring, important personalities. There are two Croatian TV programs, mostly about the 80s, Classic TV, and this is from their webpage, a meeting place of regional films, and the Yugoton TV, national music television that shows music clips from the past times, of course, most of them from the 80s. There's a TV show that is broadcasted on different TV programs, Golden Moments of Yugoslav Sports, Zlatni momenti Jugoslovenskog sporta. On radio stations, different 80s shows or nostalgia for the 80s in different countries. I've heard and I listened to these programs. When it comes to movies and TV series, they are much less enthusiastic, less carnivalesque than the music. Some of them are even tragic. And here I could mention some authors, some directors that are just named there. For example, very interesting, very popular now is the show Crno-Bijeli Svet, about two Zagreb families in the 80s. To go on this path, there are some fantastic documentaries that were made recently, again, about punk and the new wave scene, so very 80s music, or the rock scene in general, about the crucial bands, again, Pankrti, Laibach, and others. I would like to mention here the Sretno Dijete, the documentary by Igor Mirkovic. The culture virus came also to the internet. There are, immense number of different Facebook groups on the Instagram, YouTube, blogs, and so on. I would just like to mention one of them, the 80s in Zagreb, 80 u Zagrebu from 2014. It has a page that there are 35,000 or now even 38,000, I checked recently, members. It is based in Zagreb. Then in consumer culture, not to open this field, nostalgic weekends in supermarket, offering products from survived brands from Yugoslavia, or Yugo tourism with the nostalgic bars, restaurants, and so on and so on. Not to speak about fashion and the design with retro aesthetics, part of hipster culture, and so on and so on. To go briefly through exhibitions, retrospectives, there are two kinds of most important ones. are, on the Yugoslav visual arts and design. Again, from Belgrade to Ljubljana. I'm mentioning here just one of them, 80s through the prisms of events, exhibitions, and discourses from Ljubljana, or everyday life. These are very, very popular, attracting, really thousands of people coming, like this one, Life Was Never Better, that started in Belgrade and ended up in Ljubljana a few years ago, or 80s, the sweet decadence of the postmodernity that was taking place in Zagreb. But I would like to speak a little bit more about the post-Yugoslav literature about the 80s. And again, I'm facing this problem that I mentioned before. Some of these books, essays, poetry are not only about the 80s. Some of them are decades before, some of them are after, some of them are having even a longer span, the whole 20th century. But there's a kind of, again, almost a pattern, very autobiographical, that strongly reflects this temporal and spatial framework. In many cases, we can speak about this romana clé, so fictional rendering of actual events and person, starting from Radakovic, Vujicic, and others. Many times it's very much connected with the music, kind of Sex and Drugs and Red Stars types of novels. There's a lot of humor in it, and I'm dividing, this, as I said, the selection of the books that I took into consideration. Those who are concentrated only on the 80s, and this is the first half, and the second half who, in a way, extend this 80s before and after. And now I would like to speak about some similarities, despite many, many differences that you can imagine, or beyond, even beyond that, because it took me some years, to conclude this, analysis. The first commonality, the first recognizable characteristic is that this is kind of part of the global retromania trend. This post-Yugoslav escapes to the trips to the 80s are part of what Simon Reynolds called the retromania. So it happens everywhere. It's not just another East European, or Balkan, or post-Yugoslav specificity. Second thing is that we cannot, to understand this post-Yugoslav reflections of the 80s, we can also, we must go back in time, to understand them from within. On one side, the 80s were shaped by this economic and political decline. On the other side, and this is inherent, I believe, also in many of the attitudes of the writers, the poets, the musicians about the 80s. On the other hand, this creative explosion within the cultural and artistic field. So 80s were happening after the so-called led 70s, all of Nesedam Desete, and before the war-stained 90s. So it's a very specific decade. Thirdly, these representations are located between trauma and nostalgia, which coexist in conflict as the two extremes of the same process, and this is mourning. But what I find interesting is that these authors mostly don't parasite in this element of the mourning, but this is for them just their starting point, not the fatalistic end of the story. So what should we do after this tragic experience of the when the 80s ended? Then in many of these works, there's an overlapping spatial and temporal identity. Youth ended, and also Yugoslavia ended. Goodbye teens and goodbye Yugoslavia. So kind of double break that is overlapping at the end of this decade. Then another double issue, the double 80s, if I may say so, that is also reflected in these works. So the first half of the 80s, kind of happier, more optimistic half. The sprouting of new subcultures, music, civil society, new lifestyles, and so on. And the second half is much more bitter, much more sober, much more depressing. The catastrophe was already on site, if I may say so. There was expectation of the war, of the conflict, you know. So the second half, it's much more depressing, the rise of economic, political, and ethnic tensions. Then there are very different images of the 80s in the subsequent decades. Here I relate to the works of Trifonova and again Masha Kolanovic. The 90s were marked with revisionism, and this showed also in the artistic and the cultural reflections of the 80s. Then after 2000, already, you know, the emergence of bittersweet nostalgia, if I may generalize, quite a lot. In 2010, the next decade, Yugoslavia, socialist Yugoslavia, and especially the 80s, are seen as a kind of historical curiosity. And now in the last decade, with the deepening the crisis that we were mentioning before, discovering the revolutionary and emancipatory political potentials of Yugoslavia in the desert of post-socialism, if I may refer to the famous phrase of Štiks and Horvat. It shows in the radical art, in the cultural alternatives, in workers' and students' protests, progressive sub-politics, and the new subcultures. The last two common characteristics is that this is most of these works are created by the last Yugoslav generation. So the generation that was marked, as I mentioned before, the cultural blossoming on one side and the political disintegration on the other side. We can even speak about a special trans-realist genre where biographical and autobiographical beats elements can be found in their fiction. They're becoming part of their fiction, stories, poems, songs, and so on and so on. And secondly, I mentioned the last generation. This last generation is not the lost generation. So we can speak about developing personal and social construction of resistance to the existent, to the post-Yugoslav condition. So this experience of rupture, of collapse, of conflict, of the war hides the seed of the revolt in the present. And to conclude, not to be too long, if I return to this initial Adorno's dilemma on writing poetry after wars, after atrocities, after Auschwitz, after Srebrenica in our case. And here I refer to the question that American poet, objectivist poet, Charles Trezhnikov did to this question by doing what artists have always done in finding appropriate technical means. So I see this artistic and cultural reflections of the Yugoslav 80s not merely as a cultural inspirations or creative ideas, but also, or sometimes even mostly, as seeds of social dissent, emancipatory calls for action, kind of political slaps to the ideological construction and political practices of in power today. So they offer kind of politically relevant, not only artistically, not only culturally, not only aesthetically, but also politically relevant otherness to the situation in post-Yugoslavia today. So they are claiming, and this is, I believe, the main advantage of this production, that if the alternative existed back then, that it exists also now. And their works, in a way, show this, prove this. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Velikonja. Just a couple of announcements before we continue with the discussion. about the three presentations, because Professor Nielsen had to leave relatively quickly, so he won't be able to answer questions related to his presentation. I just wanted to say that I invite, pardon me, I invite all the participants and the viewers to engage in a discussion about all three presentations, Professor Halilovich, Professor Velikonja, and Professor Axbo-Nielsen as well. Following that discussion, we have two remaining presentations. We won't have a break because, unfortunately, due to COVID-related health emergency, our second closing keynote presenter, Dr. Wolfgang Petric, will not be joining us. He was advised by his physician that he had to be admitted to hospital, and I wish him a speedy recovery. So the good news is that we will finish early, so those of you in the wee hours of the morning that are still awake will have at least a chance of a decent sleep. The bad news is that we won't have a chance to listen to the closing remarks by Dr. Petric, but I'm quite certain that we'll have another opportunity to do so. So I invite all the participants to engage the presenters in a question, in a discussion, and also I invite the viewers to type their questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen. Thank you. Professor Malešević, you have the floor.
Yeah, I always monopolize this thing. Start first. I had a question for Hariz before, and now I have a question which is really for both Hariz and Mitja, and I enjoy very much both of your presentations. So I want to connect them in some way because they deal with similar part of the world and have a very different take in some respects because they're dealing with different groups. So just for Hariz, I kind of very much enjoy this kind of analysis of triumphalism, as a next stage of denial. And what's interesting really is that this wasn't as visible, as present, as strong after the war. So it has become much more visible now in the last, let's say, 10 years. It has become more, in some respects, also institutionalized, as you show, the state doesn't really, the state either encourages it or it just let it go. And most of all, it has become part of popular culture for some groups. So I think that's very important. And maybe to kind of, if you could tell us a little bit more, how do you see it? Why is it so strong now? And it wasn't as strong before. And for Mitja, it's also, I think, what's interesting that you are perhaps focusing on different groups. You're focusing on the kind of urban, disenchanted youth who grew up in this kind of post-Yugoslav context, and they are very different from the groups that Hariz is studying. So maybe many of these are also young. That they write these graffiti with extreme, nationalist content, and they sing these songs to insult the other group and so they're both, most of them are young, most not exclusively so, but they're very different groups. So they are part of a different subculture, maybe, although the Hariz's group might be more mainstream in some respects. But I wonder, is this something to do also with their class position, their urban versus rural, or big cities versus the generational the origins? Some people might be originally from kind of left-wing families and others not so. And so it'd be interesting to make a link between these two papers.
Thank you, Sinisha. Mitja, do you want me to go? Thank you.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, Sinisha, thank you very much for your questions and observations. And yes, what used to be perceived as extremist immediately after the war has become normalized more recently. I think there are several reasons why this happened, and this is unfortunate trend. It could have been stopped, should have been stopped, but hasn't. And one of, even I alluded in my presentation, kind of the age of post-truth, the availability of content that is either not questioned or perceived as as having some face value. So that, social media and the internet, which did not exist, at least not to that extent immediately after the war, has been available to everyone. The content is shared. There are law regulations do not exist that sanction hate speech, for example, or denial of genocide. In the end, even the law that created the current situation shows how much the mainstream politics has been riding on that triumphalism. So that war criminals are literally celebrated, and not in some private domain, some remote villages, with gusle, but it is very much in the top, highly rated shows such as Srebrenica, the Belgrade-based, show, or generally popular culture. So I do think that masses will pick up on things that are available to them. And some of them are literally they are banal in terms of how they are performed. Like, they are at weddings singing about Vukovar, Pazar becoming Novi Vukovar, Sjenica, Nova Srebrenica. Like, it just kind of banal context. And they are even worse, which I didn't show, like a young child being given beer to drink and then singing about, old Muslim women, you can be at peace now because all yours got slaughtered and only the one is hanging at the mosque. So it rhymes. It's a kind of like some song that is just sick in its lyrics and everything else. But it has been so banalized that I think it's almost not that those who perform it or indulge in listening, they don't even think of what it means. But I do think that the responsibility of the societal responsibility now, not necessarily the state, but also those who were in charge of creating better environment for younger generation. And I think the younger generation is more extreme than those who remember the 80s, about which Mitja has been talking. So because they do not have memories of the 80s, they do not have that shared cultural space. And it is, in many regards, it's very kind of not only post-truth, it's also very what we used to call postmodern. I mean, it's a mixture of everything. You would have very kind of people who you could associate with, I don't know, or who associate themselves with global popular culture and hip hop, probably, or listen to both what used to be a sin in the past. Like, you don't listen folk music or tuba folk and rock and roll. Like, rock and roll was an ideology, was something, that you wouldn't mix. Today's generation mix everything. And then rock and roll has also, it's not that, those, even some of the 80s are not the old rock and roll stars like, Riblja Čorba, that the Yugoslav bands became nationalist bands. Not national, but nationalists, some of them. So I think the whole kind of that cultural space has also contributed to such flourishing of that triumphalist culture. And once this was labeled and defined as hate speech, for example, as it would in Australia and Canada and every normal country, then the people would be, that would change gradually. I think that's the only ad hoc approach at the moment.
Siniša, if I may just continue. Siniša, you're very right. My perspective is to a large degree different from Hariz. I'm mostly interested in the works of writers, of the poets, of the musicians, digital artists, and so on, kind of top-down approach. I'm interested in their production, so in kind of discourse, but it would be equally interesting, and this would be a nice, kind of counterbalance to do our sociological research, a bottom-up research of the wider population. It would be interesting to ask people how they feel about the 80s, and then to compare with the cultural and artistic reflections of this same 80s. I know that there are some questions in World Values Survey some years ago. How do you compare your life, in different decades, but I don't see them now for some time already. Maybe this question is a problematic one, a political one, because how can you justify, the transition if most of the people still think better of the 80s and 70s and so on. They appreciate more the previous leaders, Tito and the others, they are still on the partisan side of partisan interpretation of the history. Very inconvenient questions, And these are very delicate public opinion, researcher surveys to do. That's why, I'm missing them for some years now. Very, very few questions about the evaluation of the past. But on the side of the artists, of the scholars, there's, as I said, abundance of it. I was showing, in a very few words, only, really the selection of the selection of the selection. Behind every book and every author that I mentioned, there are many others, So this is the missing part, the missing half, the missing lung of the whole story about the 80s today.
But it's interesting, see that what both of you are saying, Mitja and Hariz, is there are audiences for both of these. There is an audience for extreme, nationalism. There is also audience for retro view of the, kind of more left-wing interpretation of past and reality. Although the left wing is more underground in some respects in most states, and it seems to be because it is you're kind of presenting the elite view, but it's read. There is audience for this, so there must be a lot of people, young people, who are actually reading these books and listening to these musics and watching these films, but they don't have a voice perhaps as strong as the nationalists.
That's true. That's the eternal problem, isn't it? How to transform these voices, critical voices, to, I don't know, the political participation. But as I mentioned before, there were demonstrations, protests, civil initiatives, there's a left party, the first one in Slovenia, that speaks about, the issues that none of the previous parties, even the ex-communists, the social democrats, are not speaking about, So there are small steps still, but still it's not so hopeless as it seems. People go to that kind of concerts, read that kind of graffiti. I'm doing graffiti studies very much lately, so there's a lot of confrontation going on, and it's a battle, an open battle, as it always was. It is taking place also now, so it's a battlefield.
Thank you, Professor Velikonja and Professor Halilovich. I just have a quick question / comment and the invitation for your thoughts on it, about what Professor Halilovich talked about genocide triumphalism. I was wondering if we could at all, if it is legitimate or could be supported by any evidence, if we could insert the international community in this discussion, and while talking about triumphalism, genocide triumphalism, after a certain period of time, could we possibly engage this idea about the absence of a more substantial or more severe, if you wish, legal sanction by the international legal bodies of all the atrocities that took place in the former Yugoslavia, parallel to the political and economic survival of the wartime elites in the country that provided the impetus for this genocide triumphalism in the specific case of Serbia, for example. So obviously time was needed for this specific expression of support for war crimes and shaping up culturally and otherwise of the understanding of the form of participation in the war by national political elites and national armies. But I was wondering if we could lay any, not blame, but responsibility for this at the feet of the international community. Do you think it would be a reasonable thing to talk about?
I definitely think that there's a big portion of blame or responsibility of the international community, whatever that international community might represent, by talking about the immediate neighborhood, like European Union, for example, that European Union standards not only of what it's civil behavior and what's acceptable, what's not, but also what's legal code. For example, denying Holocaust in European Union is illegal, and even before this became topical, there was a case in Austria where a British historian was jailed and taken to court for denying the Holocaust or parts of that. So I think I'm not a lawyer and I wouldn't be able to comment on how this could apply to the what's denied or glorified and considered at least as hate speech in the region. But public pressure has shown, or in the last few days actually, has yielded some results where one of the scholars who was on a commissioned, he was commissioned by the Republika Srpska government, by Dodik, to literally create a report denying Srebrenica. He was to receive a presidential award in Germany, and thanks to the public pressure coming from across society, and not necessarily led by Bosnians or the survivors, that was cancelled. Initially postponed, but I think it's cancelled. Unfortunately, this didn't have much impact on the Handke being, receiving the Nobel Prize for Literature, and we know that Handke hasn't been much of a writer in the last 30 years, but more kind of political activist and apologist for Milosevic crimes. And I called him the first ethnographer of Srebrenica genocide, because he literally was the first at the scene after genocide was committed in Srebrenica, and took pictures, was photographed there on the scene. So I wouldn't question his literature before that, but everything he wrote was really to kind of apologies for Milosevic and his regime. And yeah, Nobel Prize went to him, and as much as it was contested by the wider society in Sweden, it didn't result in him not receiving it.
Thank you, Hariz. I do have a very quick follow-up question related to what Professor Malešević was mentioning earlier, and rightly so, the numerical minority in all of the successor states of the former Yugoslavia that is left-leaning, pro-Yugo-nostalgic sentiment population, usually younger, that has the real-time problem of formulating their political voice and acquiring certain political strength in terms of being able to actually gain office in some measurable respect. I was just wondering if you would Professor Halilovich and the rest of the participants, of course, would you think that the more substantial engagement, more open engagement of the international community on these issues of preventing genocide, triumphalism, would at the same time serve as the encouragement and support for this minority in the process of its acquiring a substantial political footing?
I do think that these minorities are not necessarily tiny groups. They're especially young people, and the popular culture of the 80s and Yugoslav popular culture does appeal to them. And some festivals have been very successful. That's kind of meeting the commercial aspect, but also providing experience and like Sutjeska Zelengora, but the festival, music festival. Has been very, very popular across the former Yugoslavia, across the region, and bands that perform there are also those type of bands that are seen as not being necessarily identified as belonging to a particular state or nation or ethnicity, but are kind of, representing the Yugoslav culture. I do think that such initiatives, which do not necessarily need to be promoted from outside, but, homegrown, but supported, they need support, financial, political, even like in alternatives such as, Pride, for example, festival or Parada. It's all such kind of alternatives have provided avenues for progressive voices to be heard, solidarity to be shared. And I know, for example, in Sarajevo that after the first first issues with the first Pride, and the second and third, it became a massive event where young people went, not just young people, but creating spaces, safe spaces, where these people are not minority any longer, probably would be a way to go. In Bosnia, there are several, and not only in Bosnia, also Serbia and Croatia, they kind of cover. There are several educational programs, experiential programs that bring young people from different ethnicities, and it's kind of like a traveling summer schools, and they go and they visit both kind of Second World War and more recent wars, places of suffering, atrocities, monuments, and through traveling, they also, it's not necessarily learning about content so much, but them creating space where they can meet for the first time those kids that were born after the war in Nevesinje, and kids born in Zavidovici will never meet, or don't have anything in common. But bringing them there, that's for the first time, young people, living in the same country, can learn not only with each other but also from each other. So that's something but it's still very much at grassroots level. But these programs are supported by foundations such as Konrad Adenauer, for example, foundation, and similar foundations present in the region. So I would argue for more funding and more of such opportunities where creating safe spaces and content is either music or something else that's fun. But maybe the posters like yours behind you. Yeah.
If I may say so, I have doubts about the positive role of international community when it comes to supporting, non-nationalist left-wing initiatives and so on, because the bottom line, it's still the same as I mentioned before. The basic assumption of the EU is the condemnation of three totalitarianism. So fascism, Nazism, and communism, they're all the same. And this is the basis of the two leading, policies, ideologies and policies, ethno-nationalism and neoliberalism, So the whole frame is very much fixed, and it's very difficult, we see from the cases also of the EU countries like Poland today, or Hungary, or even Slovenia now, of the limited range of the self-proclaimed, EU, role of democratization, of bringing, tolerance and so on, Hafiz, you were mentioning, the denying Holocaust, the anti-Semitism that is spreading, in the countries that I mentioned, which is again, it is not properly confronted. Why? Let's see deeper, the ideological basis of the EU as we know it today, and it's repeated. That's why also I asked this question in the beginning, to Eric, it is not just imposed from the outside, but also it's homegrown, and it fits very well together. Balkanization, and self-Balkanization, and nationalism, that it's, as I said, supported and not limited by EU as we know it now.
Both of you, we have 3 questions from the viewers, and I will read them consecutively. They're not listed or directed to any one of the participants specifically, but I would invite you all to engage these questions. The second question that deals specifically with Montenegro, I will also have to say a couple of things just to clarify matters before letting you guys have a swing at it. The first question is from Holden Nicolaisen, and it reads, what is the most important thing that the upcoming generation should take away from the war in Yugoslavia, particularly with decreasing interest and knowledge on the topic in younger generations? So we'll go question by question. So any of you, if you would care to comment on the most important takeaway from the Yugoslav crisis.
May I start? Well, no, coming from the field that I mentioned, so art, culture, and so on, I believe that the most important message would be that another world is possible. The world of, that was not perfect, of course, it's not just another nostalgic reverie, but still, the world where, interethnic, friendships and marriages and other things were possible, of the social justice, of the health security, of the tolerance, of the cooperation. And I believe, that speaking about the field that I worked on, art and culture, there are so many examples coming from there. So my answer would be read more, listen more, to that kind of works, There are much more that we expect, and they are in the shade, a very deep shade, of the dominant discourses, but they are still there.
Thank you, Professor Velikonja. Yes, yeah, Professor Halilovich, go ahead.
I did mention my previous answer, these opportunities for creating safe spaces where young people can meet and learn together, learn about each other, from each other on a content that's shared. So it is the recent past, for example, because they shouldn't be hostages to the recent histories and the generations that created, not only initiated the war, led it, but also created a situation which is post-war. And how long post-war lasts? For these young people, post-war has been all their lives. And when I talk about post-war, we talk post-war here, it's part of our lives, maybe half of our lives. But for these kids, kids for our, generation, for us, they are adults. They are in their 20s, and everything they know, it's being born in a post-war country. From the outsiders, we'll call it, a transitional country. So what they are transitioning into, and creating safe spaces, and where the prejudices are not just kind of ideologically imposed from above, but really, it doesn't make sense to, you can mock someone on something else, but not because of name or religion or place that they live in. So for that, lived experiences are needed, I would believe.
Thank you, Professor Halilovich. The second question comes to us from Jason Gold, and let me read it. It relates to Montenegro and a couple of specific things that I'd like to address, and then I will let you guys take a swing at it. So the question reads, right-wing populism across the region has been tapping into the collective sense of disenfranchisement and ergo victimhood. Whatever that in fact may be, the panel seems to have totally ignored the pernicious influence of driving forces of right-wing populism in the region, i.e. Steve Bannon's movement and Jim Dawson's Knights Templar International. In Montenegro, for example, the political influence of such organizations via either Medojević's PZP, one of the founders of Steve Bannon's movement, or Knights Templars International via its close ties to Putin Night Wolves, who have been present here in Montenegro in recent months and have close ties with radical Serb nationalist group in Serbia. As someone who was a founding member of the PZP, or Movement for Change's political party, and a Montenegrin who extensively wrote about the very issues mentioned in this question, just wanted to say that it is not entirely fair to accuse the panel of ignoring this particular topic. It is the constraint of time and themes that we intended to cover, and the fact that I was unable to complete my presentation on those very issues due to COVID-related health problems. Leveling the charge against the panel is not entirely fair, because the issues mentioned are true, are of concern or grave concern for many, and should certainly be addressed. I do hope that all of us that participate in this panel, including the viewers, would take the opportunity to address these elevated tensions in the region and the re-emerging of the extreme right-wing claro-nationalist forces into the field of politics, and they're taking over of the sort of a realm of governments in Montenegro, and as we can see in the Republic of Srpska and Serbia. So saying all this, I would love to hear what the panelists think of this question, and so I open the floor to you.
I think Mitja already mentioned that the context, which is not only regional, it's European. So right-wing populism is not something that just homegrown or invented or embraced. It is really European phenomenon. And the wars that were fought in the 1990s there, those wars of aggressions and atrocities, they were committed by those who associated themselves with far-right politics. So it was easy kind of to revive those political tendencies and political movements, such as Šešelj, who was radical. He calls himself radical. He was a war criminal who was sentenced war criminal, but he's still physically, taking space in media in Serbia. He's still active, but is not. There's no one from European Union sending Interpol after him or imposing any sanctions on media that promote him. So I do agree with Jason's comment. Yes, Russia has been very active, and not only in Serbia and through Putin's nightfalls, but also in Bosnia. So probably Dodik is currently the main Russian player in the Balkans, not necessarily Vučić or those pro-Russian groups in Montenegro. So it shouldn't be ignored, does exist, and Vučić was Šešelj's protege. I know that's tells you about the far right populism being mainstreamed in the region and being kind of tamed almost, which is somehow acceptable because he hasn't got a beard or whatever someone is expected from a radical.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Halilovich. We have Dr. Gordi and then Ambassador Garcevic.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Srdja. I could maybe say a word about right-wing populism that also addresses a little bit this question of what the most important lesson is, because I think that at the time that the wars were coming to an end in former Yugoslavia, that a lot of us observing both from inside and outside were excessively optimistic. We believed that that democratic orders would be constructed within the framework of a stable and sustainable system led especially by Europe. And what we've seen in the time coming since then is that we were much too optimistic. I mean, not just about what would be constructed in the region, but about how sustainable this democratic system of tolerance and openness is, and how we really ignored many signs that in retrospect should have been obvious about how fragile they are. These are things that only became apparent when we saw things like in the United States, an armed mob storming the parliament, or when we see the increased not just the increased frequency of racist attacks, but the increased social acceptability of racist language and racist framing of issues. So I think that maybe, you know, the chief lesson to take, and here, I mean, we don't even need to fetishize former Yugoslavia. There have been other conflicts since then that have lasted longer and that have been more violent and have had more victims. What we need to understand is that the dynamics that we see of the tolerance of an unaccountable political elite, the breakdown of social institutions, and the erosion of trust in institutions can and do happen in other places. And if nothing, former Yugoslavia becomes kind of a set piece showing us how the story develops.
Thank you, Srdja. If I may, then I will make 3 points briefly about the question posed by the audience, the viewer. First of all, I agree that though different various nationalistic populist movements may occur as different, as different on the surface, while here in the US, populists are mostly focused on race, and the issue and the narrative revolves around race. In back home or back in the Balkans, it revolves around ethnicity and religion. But deep down, they have similar or the same ideology. So they can be inspired by certain movements from outside, but they also inspire, as you could see, the terrorist in New Zealand was inspired by events in Bosnia and Herzegovina and Radovan Karadzic. It may sound strange, but I would say that when it comes to some of those who were mentioned in the question, and their attempt to get connected with, let's say, populist and right-wing movements from the West, I would say it comes from their interest to seek global recognition and rebranding. I think that they would like to walk out from Russian shadow and to get support also from the Western populist and radical right-wing movements, and to present them being more than just Russian players in the region. I see this as one of the motives why they want to get connected with not just Bannon, but also right-wing and populist movements in Europe. They would like to get their support for their how to say political agenda in the region. As I see the West, the EU in this case, and I will be talking about it a little bit more later on, does little to prevent this from happening.
Thank you, Ambassador Gacevic. Just to complement your answer regards to Montenegro, I completely agree that in large measure the desire was to seek international recognition and to some extent get away from the shadow of Russia. In the case of Movement for Changes, which was the party that was mentioned in the question, and I can attest to this as an active participant in the process, that parted ways with the political organization on precisely this point. The desire for international recognition led this political party into the warm embrace of a conservative political forces in Europe, and then led to what we see them act today. The rationale presented by the party leadership at that time, against I argued quite strongly but unsuccessfully, was that the party did not really have any of the sort of a centrist or left of center political forces, social democratic organizations, because it was the territory already populated by then the ruling Democratic Party of Socialists, and the Social Democrats from Montenegro. So the only option was to seek alliance with the first and foremost British conservatives, and then later on, as the situation deteriorated within the party, to try to establish links with the Steve Bannon's movement. So I just wanted to insert those specific comments into Ambassador's answer. And I also need to proceed with the third question from the audience, which brings us back to points argued. It comes to us, Joseph Ingram, and it reads, as a member of the international community working both in Bosnia and Herzegovina from 2000 to 2003, and the former Yugoslavia in the mid of 1980s, I would agree that Srdja's question is critical. A bit of self-promotion. Both Dodik and Čović were tolerated and in some cases encouraged by certain PIC members, and they are now surviving and further enriching themselves by using ethnic nationalism and triumphalism to do so. What should be done today by the international community to get them out of office? I invite all the participants to try to answer the question.
Joseph, if no one is volunteering, I'll just briefly reply to Joseph. Joseph, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your observation, Joseph, and for Srdja posing this question. There are sadly so many examples that we can pick up right now from what's happening, in particular in Bosnia, down there, with, for example, High Representative not being allowed to present his report at the UN Security Council because of Russia's veto. So the PIC, which is the PIC members, the ambassadors of the countries involved in the signing of Dayton, are also very divided. Today, right now, when we have this conference, there is Orban, visiting not presidency of Bosnia-Herzegovina, not the state of Bosnia-Herzegovina, but Republika Srpska and Dodik. So talk about far right. Far right is a pan-European or European or beyond Europe even phenomenon that's very in these days. So it is very much the international community, which is very split, very fragmented, has always been. There has never been kind of monolithic international community that would have one approach to something. There are different interests there, but now there are also different ideologies that are kind of leading or supporting, especially Dodik in the moment, who is most destructive, most blunt in his intentions, but still there is no kind of firm action against him. There are still those who support him, like Russia or Orban or Janša. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Halilovich. Anyone else would like to take this question?
If I may add a couple of points.
Of course.
Being one of who co-signed a letter lately asking for more U.S. involvement in the Balkans, and also we co-authored an op-ed and also met with people in the Senate lately. I would like to say how I see the momentum, the dynamics currently in the Balkans and in the international, in the global scene. Let's say in the Balkans, I think we need intervention. We need some type of intervention and more involvement of the West, including the EU and the EU particularly, and the US. But although I'm personally very much for that, realistically speaking, I think that the time of that type of intervention is behind us. And then, I think that both the US and the EU would rather go for some type of a low-scale presence, trying to mitigate current problems rather than, to be like to put pressure on people who are the source of instability and problems in the region, like Dodik, who in my view is just just working in, actually he is very much in the limelight, but President Vučić is behind his activities, and he won't be able to do anything without support by Serbia. So I would say we cannot expect international community to go and ask for Dodik to be like removed from the office. It would be so much, at least at this point. But I may expect them to, to be pleasantly pushy, trying to navigate the process towards something which can be like solution which will be diffusing tension type of activities in the region right now.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Garcevic. We had another question from anonymous attendee, but so I will read it. I'm not quite sure where the question is sort of driving to, and I did ask the viewer to clarify. However, I was wondering if any of the participants would like to comment on it. The question is phrased almost as a Montenegro is simultaneously an EU domestic problem and at the same time a foreign policy issue. So that is the question slash comments. I'm not quite sure what the person meant by simultaneously being a domestic EU problem and a foreign policy issue, but I wonder if any of the participants might have a clearer idea what lies behind this question. Just wanted to do right by the viewers and read the question posed. Okay, obviously I wasn't the only one who was uncertain about the point of this question. So I wish to thank you all for the discussion, and was wondering if we could proceed. We have, due to the reasons I mentioned earlier, we have two presentations remaining, which would constitute an afternoon session.